Alright guys, the question has asked us to draw a sketch of the door shown in the photo and include all key dimensions. So that has to include the door stiles, the top rail, the lock rail, the bottom rail, the mullions that we discussed in class, and the panels. So whenever I'm starting out my sketch for this, guys, I'm trying to keep it as neat as possible, and I want to try and keep it in proportion. I'll pick a point on my page and start my sketch. And what I'm always thinking whenever I'm sketching any piece of woodwork is, how would this piece be made in a workshop? That's the whole purpose of it. We have to try to use this time in sketching to figure out how we're going to make it. What are going to be the problem areas? So that's about a proportional height for that. Next thing I want to give myself as a second line of reference, I want to give myself a horizontal line. I've drawn this vertical line, and that will represent here the lock stile. I want to give myself a line of reference going across, so I know it's going to be going across there. I know from looking at this image that that door is just over twice the height of its width. That's just looking at it with my eye, I can see that if I was to swing that point down, I'd have just over 2 of the height in the width. So roughly speaking, I want it to be about that wide. Give myself a point there. Draw it, and then we'll compare it to the sketch and see if we're happy with it. I'm happy that that's about in proportion there. So I can draw in my bottom point as well. Again, we're using the page. We're using the page to give us a parallel line. And you can strike that across. I'm just going to give myself my outside edges first, and that'll guide the sketch the rest of the way. So I have to join these 2 points up now. You can use a ruler for this if you want, but it's better in the long term if we learn how to sketch these things freehand. We won't always have the luxury of having drawing equipment. If we're out surveying, if you're working in years' time, if you're working on a building site, all you might have is a piece of paper and a clipboard and a pencil, and you'll have to record this information. Now, as I begin to infill these, I know that the first thing on that list is the door stiles. Like we said in class, the door stiles are these lads here going from top to bottom up the 2 sides. So I'm trying to pick a point that's roughly proportional in and in from both sides. Just like we did with all our sketching exercises, we're using a line we have. In this case, I'm happy with this line out here. I'm keeping this line parallel to that as best as I can. I'm trying to keep it neat and parallel. And the same on this side. So I know this piece and this piece are the same width, and I've got them about in proportion. So that's my door stiles. The door stiles, lads, almost always, and certainly in older doors, guys, the door stiles are always going to go from top to bottom. It's all one piece of timber, and it goes from top to bottom. The rails run between our stiles. They're all exactly the same length, but they do vary in width. So as you can see in this one, the top one looks exactly the same as the sides and stiles. Do you see that? So although we have this line here, we're just going to start our point here, and it should be the same width here to here as here to here, so roughly there. And again, we try and take our line across. That's our top rail. Our bottom rail is nearly double the width. So if I say it's double the width of that, approximately, and then go up again, So that is about 2 times the width of that. I can draw my line across at that point. Again, I'm keeping this parallel as I can to the base. Keep going back and checking it. This is a sketch, so I can check my lines a few times. Now what we notice about these panels, the top panel is a lot longer than the bottom panel. So it's no good I drawing a lock rail up here. I know it's going to be down here somewhere. Exactly where it is, we have to try and gauge using our eye and our hand. I would say it's about there. It's just below the halfway point. The top line of the lock rail is just below the halfway point of the total door. So I can draw that across. I'm keeping it. Again, I'm taking my time to try to draw it square as possible. So this and this give me a 90-degree angle. I can also see from the width of that, it's wider than the top. It's not quite as wide as the bottom piece. So it should be about there. Slightly narrower than this, not very much. And I draw that parallel again. Again, these are rails. They run between the stiles. So I know that I can stop at that point. Do you understand that? These rails have to stop at that point on the stile. That's the way the door is made. Whenever we're making this door, we make all these stiles exactly the same width. That way the door stays totally parallel. The last pieces that we have on this door are these mullions. They're a bit narrower than our stiles on our top rail, and they're centered. So first thing we'll do is find the center of the door. And I'm going to give myself a guideline, very light line, running right down through the center of the door, top to bottom. That's my guideline. And now in just light lines, I'm going to come off that about the width that I want to draw that piece in. Remember, it's slightly narrower than this, so we can go even narrower again. About there. And now, as I go down, I'm keeping parallel to this very light construction line I've given myself down the center of the door. Again, this mullion runs between rails, so I can stop this line here. Now, on a painted door, lads, it's going to sometimes be hard to identify where pieces end and where they start again. And that's where our heads as woodworkers and as design thinkers have to come into it. We have to give an educated guess based on what we've seen before and what we know about timber work. Generally speaking, in doors, traditional panel doors like this, you're going to have these mullions and they'll run and stop at the lock rail. So I've tapered in there a little bit. Just going to try and even that out a little bit with my pencil strokes. So that's my mullions. I'm not going to worry too much about this edge detail. As we saw earlier on the slides, we have what's called a stopped miter running down here. But to save a bit of time, I'm not going to draw them in right now. What I'm more concerned about is filling in all my dimensions. First thing I do to that is I give myself lines. I know that I want to measure from the top to the bottom. At very least, that's what I need from my door drawing. I also know that at very least I need to measure from the left to the right. And I know that all my measurements are going to be able to run along that line. And I know that all my height measurements are going to be able to run along that line. So again, we're keeping these as neat as possible. You don't rush these things. Keep them nice and neat and straight. Now, what does the drawing ask it for? It asks for the dimensions of the door stiles. So I can bring a line down here, and there's my other door stile. I can bring a line down here. We know that they're parallel the whole way up, we can see that. So there's no need for me to infill any more figures or dimensions up or down that door. I now have a space to infill a dimension for my door stiles. The next thing it asks for is the top rail. Well, I know my top rail is up here, so I can just trace across and give myself a line there. Okay, we're in line with it. This is how we represent dimensions on drawings. So as we're not drawing dimensions all over our sketch, we can keep all the dimensions out to one side or along the bottom. It asks for the dimensions of the top rail, of the lock rail, which is also sometimes called the middle rail. Remember what we said in class, lads? It's called the lock rail because traditionally this is where we put the lock of the door and the handle of the door. And we're also asked for the dimensions for the bottom rail, which is this fella down here. So again, take that out, and that's going to be the measurement for that. It asks for the mullions as well. We want a width for these mullions, so we can mark that down onto our bottom scale. And the last thing it asks for are the panels. And what we can see from this is that here to here is exactly the same as here to here. That's the height, that's going to be the height of our panels. And here to here is exactly the same as here to here. So we can infill the width of our panels. Now I can begin to infill the dimensions. First of all though, I'm going to draw in all of my arrows so as I can see where I am measuring to and from. Keep these really neat. We can get our arrowheads right on the point that we're measuring to or from. And the whole idea, lads, is that anybody who's working in a workshop, or an architect who's designing a building, or an engineer who's working on the house, can look at this drawing and understand straight away what size everything on the door is. They can generate a cutting list from it if they're the maker, or they can specify what's to go where, how big the opening has to be if they're going to be the architect. But they all need to know what this door looks like, and they need to know its definite dimensions. So I'm going to start infilling my dimensions now. If I was measuring this on site, I would be using a tape measure to measure all of these. Thankfully I already have these measurements, so I can start to fill them in. I know that my top rail is 110 millimeters. Keep these really neat, keep them in between the lines, keep all the numbers of a similar height, and put the units of measurement we're using. Always include the units of measurement. I know that my top rail is 110 millimeters. I know that my lock rail is 190 millimeters. And I know that my bottom rail is 220 millimeters. This bottom panel here is 500 mil. And the top panel from here to here is 980 millimeters. I have all those individual measurements in. If I was to take a calculator and add them up, so I have 110 plus 980 plus 190 plus 500 plus 220, I have a total height of 2000, that's 2 meters. That's the height of that door. You never have to over-define a sketch. If we have all of these measurements on, we know we can add all of them up and get to our 2 meters or 2000 millimeters. We don't have to put in a separate definition of the height of the door. Likewise, across the way, we have a stile over here that's 110 millimeters. The mullion in the centre is 85. And again, our style is 110. Both of these panels, I know from measuring them, are 322 millimeters wide, and the ones on top are the same width. So we can write in our 322 millimeters again. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over my sketch to make sure that it's perfectly clear what I've drawn. I'm going to go over all of these lines. I'm going to use a pen. You can use a HB pencil or another B pencil, so that's a soft leaded pencil that will leave a good dark line. But again, always when I'm sketching timber work, I'm sketching it just as it would be made. The door styles run from top to bottom. I'll draw both of them in. From top to bottom. Keep it nice and neat. And we can start infilling these lines across the way. Infill all of these lines. Again guys, if you don't get round to doing this part of it, that's okay, as long as we can clearly see what lines there are. I'm just making sure that this can be seen clearly on the camera. It does help if you've got some time at the end of it to go over these lines. It will improve the appearance of your sketch. Infill the last mullion. Now as I'm filling these in, I can be thinking about the next move I'm going to make, which is just to jot down on this sketch where the letter plate is. There's a central doorknob on this door here, and there's a door knocker. There's a little escutcheon over here, and here's my lock cylinder up here. There's lots of little details in this door. I'm not going to measure them out in this sketch. I'm going to draw them approximately in the right place, so as I can notify my architect what is going where. Letter plate is about there. We've got a door knocker, sorry, a central doorknob that sits about there. The door knocker is up there. If we look, always looking for reference points, the door cylinder, the top of it is roughly in line with the bottom of the door knocker. You see that? So across from there, that's where our lock is placed, and then we have an escutcheon just above the line of the lock rail. Don't worry about all the technical terms just yet, guys. That'll all come. We just want to get used to the idea of recording the information that's there as accurately as we possibly can. Now, as you can see, that is a simplified version of this door. I've left the decorative detail from the edges of the door, because that's not what's important right now. What's important now is that I can accurately record all of the relevant measurements on this sheet.